It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And boy, we've got a big show for you today. We're going to talk about antitrust updates. We're going to talk some boxing. We're definitely going to talk about UFC Atlanta. We're going to talk about Francis Ngannou. We're going to talk about the presidential parade even. We have some brand new one championship finances that John got hold of as well. But y'all know the drill right here. If you want access to everything, you must subscribe because some of this will be behind a paywall. Now, John, how the heck are you?
Good. I'm hoping that with the show, the stock full of all this content that I might not be prepared to talk about, serves as a good distraction because there's a lot of news out there right now that makes us all a little tense probably, and hopefully this will be a good distraction for an hour or two of people's lives.
Yes, indeed. So let's get down to business. Are there any antitrust updates?
Well, the only real update, the big update is today, the day we're recording. So I guess the day this comes out, it'll be too late, is the last day for fighters to file their claims. And so fighters, if you're hearing this and you didn't have execute your claim, in other words, sign the claim form and mail it in, you are forfeiting. That means you forfeited your claim. The other fighters are going to split it. The good news is Rob Macy was on Twitter. He had a comment about how I think this is going to set a record for class member participation for number of people, the percentage of class members in an antitrust case collecting their settlement. This is going to set some sort of record, and I believe it's based on the number of fighters that confirmed and verified their address. I'm guessing it's going to be well above 95% of all fighters will have are going to mail in their claim and collect their portion of the settlement. So that part's good. The bad part is a few fighters are not going to collect. And I think at this point, we have to assume, because again, Macy did make the point that there's no one that has not been contacted. We have to basically assume that the fighters that have not verified their contact information, who are not going to send in their executed claim, have been contacted and decided on their own that they do not want, for whatever reason, they do not want their portion of the claim.
Do we know if Brock Lesnar ever got his claim in?
We don't know for sure. I'm guessing he's one of the few that did not. We'll have a way, I think, to infer based on what percentage fighters. I'll call a few fighters when they get their checks, and I know what they were supposed to get. We can calculate what they're supposed to get, and then if we figure out what their check actually was, we can figure out how much money was added based on a percentage, and then from that we can start looking through how much the totals of each fighter earned, and we can figure out which fighters maybe did not collect their settlement. He's one of the list of fighters that did not verify their address. Him, Alexander Volkanovski, Shevchenko, Valentin, who else? BJ Penn. And for all of them, they all had specific kind of reasons where you could assume why maybe they didn't want to collect, like the two current champions. Maybe they feel like it's not worth there's such a low amount of money. They didn't want to collect because they worried that it'll put them in bad light with the UFC. Brock has a relationship with Endeavor, and considering the allegations against him with Vince McMahon, maybe he feels he needs to again get on the good side of Endeavor on that. And then BJ Penn, where his mental state is currently. So those were the fighters that did not verify their contact information, but that doesn't mean they didn't get in their claims. But we won't know for sure because they are not releasing the names of those who collected and those that asked to get a claim, which I think is a mistake in some ways. I know the way they did it because a lot of fighters were scared. They were afraid that the UFC would punish them if they let their names be known that they're going to collect their settlement. But I think in some ways that also backfires because some fighters, they don't know who's not collecting. They get nervous the UFC is going to punish them anyways. And if they would have seen that some of the biggest company men had put their names in to get their money, I think they would realize, okay, there's no risk the UFC getting mad at me. I should mail in my claim anyways.
Just remind everybody a rough estimate of what Brock Lesnar would have collected.
Well, I think Brock Lesnar, he had two purses during the period, over $11 million he got. And so he would have made roughly around 3.4 million would have been if everybody collected the full amount. If there was no splitting of unclaimed settlement in addition to what he made, he would have made about 3.4 million. So if he doesn't collect that 3.4 million, it goes right back in the pot, gets split up amongst all the other fighters. So maybe it's good that he is not collecting because, everybody else will get a little bit more now.
One last question on this. Is there a possibility that Endeavor paid him to not?
No, I don't think so at all. They made it clear that they want everybody to collect their settlement, that there's no benefit for Endeavor paying them not to anyways, because they got to pay that money. If they're paying out the settlement anyways, it's going to go to other fighters. So, there's no advantage. In fact, it just would cost them more if they had to pay Brock on the side to make up for it. So I don't think that's a possibility at all. I just think whatever reason he got in his head, maybe he takes a moral stand and he thinks the UFC was on the right on this and the fighters on the wrong. Who knows? But for whatever reason, there's also the possibility too that he just didn't verify his address for the longest time because he didn't want anybody else to know he's going to collect. And now he's, last minute, he verified his contact information and mailed in his claim form. We don't know if he mailed in his claim form or not, but so that it's all up in the air about that. But there's only a select few fighters. I think there was less than 3 to 4% are the ones that did not verify their contact information. It would be out of that pool of fighters would be the ones that are not going to collect their settlement. So it looks like the vast, vast, vast majority of fighters are going to take part and collect their settlement.
I just had to get the question in for all the conspiracists out there that think that Endeavor might be paying people to not accept.
I know there are fighters nervous. Oh, Endeavor will get mad at me, or Endeavor's the remaining fighters that are part of the class action are going to get let go if they collect this. No, Endeavor does not care. I was there when they said it. Their attorney said we highly recommend UFC fighters that are in the class mail in their claim form and collect their settlement. So Endeavor does not care. And I think the number one sign they don't care. They won't be mad. Look up when you look down who verified their address, look how many company men were immediately taken off the list that they had obviously verified their contact information. Michael Bisping, Chael Sonnen, the guys that were going to testify on behalf of the UFC, they were very quick to submit their contact information. And if those guys can do it, and if all the Ali Abdelaziz guys can do it, because Ali Abdelaziz was going to, also had written letters in support of the UFC, if they're willing to collect their money as quick as possible, I think the rest of the fighters are safe.
All right. Now, a couple of weeks ago, you mentioned a case that could impact fighters' employee status. Did you have a chance to look it up?
Yes, I did. I could not remember it at the time. The case is MTR Gross versus Three Rivers Inn. And what this case is, it's a 1997 case in New York. The Supreme Court of New York, Third Department, decided the case. And what it was a professional boxer sustained serious head injuries during a boxing match held at Three Rivers Inn. Three Rivers Inn had their own boxing promotion. And his family, he lapsed into a coma and then deteriorated, unfortunately died. This incident happened, I think, in 1989, 1990 was his death. So it took several years to go through the court system. His family then sued on behalf of him for disability benefits because they claimed he was basically an employee. He should have been categorized as an employee, should have employee status, and thus should be available benefits should be available to him just like other employees as compensation. And the case with the court determined is that with boxers, they cannot have employee status. And the reason they can't have employee status is because unlike other cases or other professions, when you have employee status, is that they have basically agreed that they are intentionally going to injure each other. And you cannot have employee status, you cannot be eligible for a compensation for injury if that's your intent. There should be no liability for compensation under this chapter, the workers' compensation law, when the injury has been by willful intention of the injured employee to bring about the injury or death of himself or another. And the purpose of boxing is to punch each other repeatedly until the other guy can't fight. That is, you're engaging in a mutual combat. And because of that reason, you cannot be eligible for workman's comp. Because you're not eligible for workman's comp, you cannot be employee. You have to be an independent contractor. And this was a New York law. It has not been applied nationally. It never went to the Supreme Court. But it's precedent, and it kind of suggests that this is the problem any effort to make employee status for fighters will have based on this case is because, they are engaging in mutual combat. I'm not sure the courts will allow them to have employee status because otherwise they'd be eligible for workers' compensation, and that's not available to those that are intentionally causing injury to other people.
All right. Now we're going to move on to some other UFC content. And the first on the docket here is Justin Gaethje. And he gave an interview to Red Corner Radio. And he is very upset over UFC getting favors from him. And he was specifically referencing UFC 300, where he fought Max Holloway. And he says that he's not getting, and I quote, appropriate appreciation and pay. What do you make of his complaint?
That he hasn't been paying attention to the sport for the last couple decades? I mean, where has he been? This is a common practice. They do not, they are not your friends. They are not your buddies. The UFC will do nice things for some fighters that are nice to them, but they will never go as far for the fighters as they expect the fighters to go for them. They will never, it's not the benefits you get from the UFC are a small fraction of what you give to the UFC. And that's how the relationship works. So I guess I'm just, he never struck me as that obtuse about the sport, but apparently he is, because that is one of the most well-known things about, and not just the UFC, but combat sports, that the promoters, they do not have a fiduciary responsibility. The promoters have an adversarial relationship with the management of fighters, and they, in some ways, have an adversarial relationship with the fighters themselves. They have a mutual beneficial when they're trying to put on big fights, but they're adversarial when the idea of how we're going to split the revenue for those fights. So that's, my take is he should maybe be paying attention more.
Should he be directing some of this to Ali Abdelaziz for not having his best interests or not being able to negotiate better for him?
Well, possibly, but I don't know what the negotiations were involving Abdelaziz. It's very easy to throw Abdelaziz under the bus because, he has a long history of making comments that show that he seems to be much more on the promotion side. But I've spoken to management where they had plans for their fighter. They had suggestions that were the obvious, smarter move to make for the fighter that was much more thinking about the fighter's interest. And the fighter told them to just do what the UFC wanted, that they wanted to be in good with the UFC. They wanted to help the UFC out. So in other words, the fighter ignored their own management's advice to do what the UFC wanted, and then that came back to kind of backfire. So in this case, it's hard to say, it's easy to throw Abdelaziz under the bus, but there's so many incidents I know where the management's not to blame. So I can't in this situation say he should have done more without knowing more of the details, I guess.
All right. Now, another rumor came up that the UFC threatened Jared Cannonier with the chopping block if he did not take the MVP fight that he's going to be fighting him coming up soon. Do you find that plausible?
Oh, I mean, again, where have we been the last couple decades? This already came leaked with the antitrust discovery and the Lee v. Zuffa case. We have incident after incident of the UFC matchmakers basically threatening fighters that something bad will happen to them. They'll be cut. They'll be getting put in a bad position on a card. Whatever, penalty punishment they can face if they don't take a fight. And we even without the settlement, without the discovery from that case, we knew about this just from secondhand, from reporting, from stories from people. So this is another situation where it's not surprising, and and people that are surprised just have not been paying attention, I guess, for what's been going on in the sport for a long time.
Let's talk about Francis Ngannou, because he was very notably with Kamaru Usman at UFC Atlanta. He was wearing UFC gear. Of course, it did match Usman, so obviously that was to imply that he may have been part of Usman's team. But, do you think that maybe some negotiation took place?
That's hard to say. One is because he walked out during the weigh-ins. It's a requirement in the outfitter kit, the athletic outfitter policy. It says in the contracts, your team, your cornermen have to also wear these UFC outfits, these UFC kits. So we shouldn't read too much. Ngannou has to wear that if he wants to walk up on the stage with Usman. Now, I don't know what the reaction from PFL is because they have a relationship. Are they going to be happy with him doing this? But he asked if he wants to be with Usman. So you could read in partly like, well, obviously the UFC bans some people from even appearing in the building. They have to approve this. Randy Couture is not, the UFC completely bans him from the building from events. He had a hard time getting to be even a corner for his son when he fought in the UFC. So there is, we have past history of the UFC being very vindictive. Now, one thing you could read in is that because Dana White wasn't there, maybe that's why they let Ngannou do this. The other thing we can read in is Ngannou wasn't the cornerman during the fight itself. He was sitting in the front. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have the audio on during the broadcast. I watched some of it. So I watched several of the fights and I saw him there, but I didn't notice them talking about him. They didn't, did they ever in the broadcast, is anybody aware, did they ever put up a chyron, a name, his name underneath as a credit and stop the show, or, one of the announcing crew make a mention, DC or Anik or anybody point out that he was there? Did that happen at all?
Well, I only saw the main card. I didn't bother with the undercard. I wish I had, though, because all the knockouts were on the undercard. But during the main card, I did not hear or see. But I did send over a clip to you where the cameras caught him in the audience, and it was clear they focused on him. So I sent you that clip. So clearly the cameraman, had some inkling, and they focused in on him, but I don't know if the commentary team actually said anything. Yeah,
I mean, that would be the big question. If they pointed out, if they announced, and actually it would be sad if they didn't. I hope they did, because it is sad. I understand that they had a falling out the UFC and him, and that's one thing, but it is sad when your commentary team will not acknowledge that the man that used to hold the heavyweight belt that, has some of the most dramatic knockouts in UFC history is in the building in front row.
That would be lineal champion.
The lineal champion. That would be particularly sad, not to just at least point him out that the former UFC heavyweight champion is there. Just give him some acknowledgement. I also noticed that Usman, I had the sound on after the fight, and I noticed Kamaru Usman did not. And I'm not saying he intentionally did this, but he did not acknowledge Ngannou. He read a list of people he thanked, but he didn't mention Ngannou. Now, one possibility, just, he had a long list of other people he wanted to thank that were more important to this camp. So that makes sense. But the other thing is maybe someone told him not to thank Ngannou. I don't know. So I guess there's two ways to read it. One, he was there. They let him in the building. He did get on camera. They did let him sit up very front row. I'm sure he didn't buy the tickets. Those were gifts. So I'm sure they didn't stop Usman from maybe giving him those as gifts to sit up close. So in that case, you have to sit there and say, well, maybe there's something the UFC has patched up the relationship a little bit. It would make sense for them to want Ngannou to come back, because instantly you have several huge fights, money-making fights. So that would make a lot of sense. But the other way to read it is, well, he was there, but if no one acknowledged it, no one brought it up, mentioned on the broadcast, that they did the bare minimum to downplay it, then that also suggests maybe that they're not willing to, that they're not further along in any discussion, or there is no discussions right now. So both possibilities are there. As I said before, my understanding is the original contract he got with PFL, that the terms of that are over, and he should be a free agent right now. Maybe not a full free agent. There's probably matching rights or something in there, but he should be able to. So possibly on the sly, he talked to the UFC, but there's just no way to tell from just his presence at this event.
You mentioned how the UFC can be very vindictive, and I always get drawn back to when they wouldn't let Nick Diaz corner Nate Diaz. For the Ultimate Fighter, because remember, Nick was over at Strikeforce.
Yeah.
So I just am immediately drawn back to that.
Yeah, they've always had a policy of not, it's weird because often they're very willing to let fighters from other promotions come in and work corners. And other times they draw a line on certain fighters and, for whatever reason, that guy is no longer allowed in the building when we hold events.
Persona non grata.
Yeah, we know all about being persona non grata with the UFC.
Yes. Now, along with Francis being at UFC Atlanta, we should probably talk about the payouts because in an ultra rare moment, because Georgia is one of the last remaining states that actually reports purse payouts, knock wood, there were some shockers on there. The biggest probably being that Rose Namajunas was the one that walked away with the most at $500,000. Cody Garbrandt made a killing. He made $275,000. That was his show money. Now, it should be noted that he re-signed with the UFC before his last fight. So I guess I just want to get your take on all the purses.
Well, it was good to have finally some disclosure. That's nice that there's an athletic commission still reports these purses. I think also it's, I heard a lot of people like really surprised by some of the numbers. I didn't find them really that surprised. I guess Michael Chiesa was a little surprising, but you got to remember that he was going to sue the UFC and Conor McGregor for that incident, and then he dropped the lawsuit. And yet here he still is now collecting a very sizable purse for a guy in his position. Not saying they're related, but I would not be shocked. So there's him. I thought Rose Namajunas sounds about right. 252. She is a star. Mm-hmm. She, in fact, I would argue she's greatly underpaid considering she could headline events and stuff. But that's not surprising. 250. I know a lot of people point out Kamaru Usman only got $300,000 no win bonus. What is his manager up to? Ali Abdelaziz. But when you get a flat bonus like that at his level, I would not be shocked if he has a side letter. In fact, he'd be probably looking at this fighters based on the history of when the UFC uses side letters or letters of agreement, which are additional contracts that are not reported to the athletic commission that pay you, let's say 2 weeks after an event. He's the one fighter I would not be shocked. In fact, I wouldn't say 100% sure, but I think it's very likely he has a side letter. We should not forget when Francis Ngannou, when CAA did their report for Francis Ngannou on what are the potential bouts in boxing, how much money he could make outside the UFC when they're renegotiating, when they were negotiating with the UFC, when the sunset clause was kicking in, they kind of leaked what Kamaru Usman makes as a champion, and I think it was $2.5 million. So he was not getting that on reported purse. I don't know if he was anywhere with the reported purse, but so he was probably getting his reported purse of, 500,000 and then a side letter of 2 million plus pay-per-view points if it went above a certain point. And so I don't think he's getting, he's no longer getting the 500, 600,000 he got as a champion, as reported purse 300,000, but I would not be shocked if there was not also some side letter here. I also noticed, people look at these big numbers, and I think Zane Simon, our guy, Zane Simon, had a very observant tweet about, or X or whatever the frick we're calling that thing now, about the pay, and that you read this and you think fighter pay has gone up a lot as the early fighters, but really what this is that they're retaining fighters so long because they still keep their tier structure. You're on multiple contracts. You finish a contract, you start off like 10 and 10 or 12 and 12 at your low. Then it goes up by $2,000 increments. Then after you're on your third fight, they'll renegotiate a $20,000 contract that'll go up by $2,000. Then a $35,035 that goes up by 3, and then $50,050 that goes up by 5. And what this is assigned is not that they're increasing people's entry in the UFC's pay, is they're keeping fighters longer. And so you will see these fighters that have 10, 12, 13 fights on their third or fourth UFC fight, but are like 6 and 7 with records still in the UFC. And that would also kind of help explain why we have such terrible squash matches on these cards. I think you pointed out to me that the odds on one of them was a negative 2,100 versus 1,200.
Yes, that was Malcolm Wellmaker versus Chris Moutinho. And I have a question for you on that in just a moment.
Oh, we'll get to that in a second. But these type of these fights is they have, I mean, I think it's a sign of the disparity in talent and also just the disparity. Well, I should say, going back in the past, the UFC made a concerted effort to get the best from around the world into the UFC, weed them out, and then bring in a new fresh crop. And I think what we see with these higher purses for guys with not tremendous records, but because it's based on seniority, the longer in the UFC your pay goes up, and also these wild odds we didn't used to see in the past, is what they're having is they retain fighters and they're not as much worried about bringing in all the best fighters, weeding them out, and then moving them up the ladder. They're much more interested in, getting fighters they can trust, and then that they know that will take any fight, will show up for any card, and who can get their paperwork in place that cannot be denied to travel. And they'll keep those guys around, and then they selectively choose a few people that they think have talent, and they almost matchmake for them in a way that maybe other promotions outside the UFC would do, but Joe Silva would never do that, where they match guys up in very winnable fights in the hopes of giving them a few fights to give them a break when they first get the UFC, and then eventually they'll throw them into deep waters. But we saw that with, I think Sean O'Malley is a great example, and Paddy Pimblett, where we give them very good matchmaking that we don't give to other fighters because we pick these guys that they have some sort of charisma potential, and we want to give them a better chance of success.
There were like 5 or 6 really, really egregious squash matches where the odds were like ridiculous. But the Malcolm Wellmaker fight was by far the biggest gap in the odds. But there's another fight coming up. I can't remember what it is. It's going to be on UFC 317, but it's already set with huge gap in the odds. So we're already looking at some squash matches coming up. But to get back to Chris Moutinho, I could not help but notice that they brought him back for Malcolm Wellmaker to make an example of. And he only got $14,000 to get basically knocked into another dimension again. Sean O'Malley punished him from pillar to post. And then we had Guido Canetti, I think that's who it was. Yeah, Guido Canetti, knocked him into another dimension. We have Malcolm Wellmaker here, it's insane, and he only got $14,000. So I tweeted out that it was absolutely shameful pay by the UFC to keep bringing him back for these kind of matches. And former UFC employee Ant Evans replied to me, yeah, but others are overpaid. Now, considering that the entry-level purse is $10,000, and we saw a $10,000 purse on this card, Jose Ochoa, he made 10-10 when he defeated I can't remember. Cody Durden, when he knocked him out. Considering that the entry-level purse is $10,000, do you agree with him that some fighters are being overpaid?
Keyword is some fighters, and I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of criticism from people, but I have to agree with Ant. Yeah, some fighters are definitely overpaid. Now, do I think the fighter that got $14K to get knocked out was overpaid? No. And I mean, partly the reason I don't think he was overpaid is in a world where he would have some sort of competitive, there'd be other options for him. The fighter's obviously not I don't want to be mean to Chris Moutinho, but he's not a top fighter. His future in the sport is not long, right? That's fair to say. But you need opponents, right? You need opponents for these prospects that have a future potential. And especially if you're cherry picking their opponent, you want to give him someone that's beatable. He could leverage that in a more competitive landscape where he could actually negotiate probably a higher purse. Now, he couldn't do that in the regionals because they don't pay as much. But if you're going to be on a network broadcast, he should have the potential to say, listen, I am sacrificing my health to give this guy a chance to get a showcase win. I deserve to be compensated. Otherwise, go find yourself someone else. And then becomes the problem for the UFC. Like, how do we find someone that's respectable enough for this opponent, or someone that's not, also not dangerous enough? So the fighter should know that they have some leverage that way, but they don't. So that's, and in that case of Chris Martino, I don't think he's overpaid, but considering that what some fighters do make, I do think they are overpaid. And do you want me to elaborate on that?
Only if you wanna.
I can elaborate.
To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Ooh! Okay, the face!